News outlets in this country have covered it, but the invasion of Europe intensified this weekend. In a record-setting couple of days, more than 7,000 African migrants arrived in Italy. They came by boat, rescued from stormy Mediterranean seas by the Italian Coast Guard and also various international aid organizations. They were not returned to Libya, where they departed from, but dropped instead on Italian soil, where many of them will remain, some for generations, as beneficiaries of European welfare states. Amazingly, the same groups abetting all of this have now accused the European Union of endangering lives by not more actively picking up more migrants from the sea and importing them into Europe. It's much like how you are to blame for endangering a burglar by locking your front door. Last year, more than 350,000 migrants arrived in Europe from the Third World, and many, no doubt, were good people, and their desperation is, of course, easy to understand given where they came from. That does not alter the fact that they arrived without invitation, illegally, and at public expense, and that they will forever and profoundly change the demographics of the continent in ways that pretty much nobody who was born there ever asked for or wanted, but that nobody is allowed to complain about for fear of being attacked as immoral. It's a huge deal, but hardly anyone ever mentions it. Does that sound familiar to you as an American? It ought to. Ilya Somin is a professor at George Mason's Antonin Scalia Law School. He recently wrote a piece for the Washington Post lamenting what he called ignorance about immigration. Once people learn the facts about immigration, he says, they will become substantially more in favor of it. He himself supports open borders pretty much. Professor Somin joins us tonight. Professor, thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
I don't begrudge different views on immigration. A lot of people support it to a greater extent than I do. My complaint with your piece was the word ignorance. You ascribed it to people who disagree with you, and your point was you just don't know enough if you disagree with me, and that didn't strike me as fair.
That's not true of everyone, but it is true of many people that if you look at survey data both here and in Europe, a lot of opposition to immigration, not all, but a lot is due to ignorance about things like the numbers of immigrants, whether or not they go on welfare, and whether they increase the crime rate or lower it.
So I guess, I mean, not to turn this around on you, but it seems to me, I think your views are not fully informed. I wouldn't use the word ignorance necessarily, but you say this. In February 14, you wrote, increased immigration is unlikely to increase the size of the welfare state, when in fact there's a great deal of evidence that that's silly. Immigrants to this country take welfare at a higher rate than American citizens, and states with massive numbers of immigrants have much higher welfare rates than others, California being the most obvious example. So that's not an informed statement.
Actually, I think it is, because when you look at studies by economists across the political spectrum, you find that states controlling for other variables that have more immigrants do not have larger welfare states. Yes, California has a large welfare state. On the other hand, Texas, which has a large percentage of immigrants, has a smaller welfare state than most other states.
So the way that those studies are conducted, which I think is dishonest, Cato did a famous study like this, where they compare immigrant welfare recipients only to poor Americans and say immigrants are less likely to receive welfare. But overall, they're more likely. California has 12% of the nation's population, but has like 33% of federal welfare recipients. I mean, that's because of immigration. What's the other cause?
Even if you compare just per capita welfare spending overall in states with more immigrants compared to those with less, those that have more do not have more welfare spending. That's what Cato and also various economic studies as well find. So even if you don't compare them just to Americans of the same income class or whatnot, if you just compare states with a lot of immigrants to those with less, and get that same result.
Well, you can compare the immigrant groups, too. I mean, look, part of the reason this is a silly debate is because it pretends all immigrants are the same. And some immigrants from certain countries have very low welfare rates, and others have overwhelming, over 75% welfare rates. And so we're sort of pretending that they're all fungible, they're all the same, but of course they're not. You also said immigrants' political views, when you get right down to it, are a lot closer to those of people born here. And yet the statistics show that they're overwhelmingly not. 65% of Hispanic immigrants vote Democrat. That's not the same as people who live here. They change the political balance of a state.
What I said is that when you look at immigrants' views on particular issues, things like size of government, social issues, and the like, the gap is much smaller than with natives than many people assume. And moreover, it gets smaller in the second or third generations. With Hispanic immigrants, these statistics often overestimate the difference because many second and third generation descendants of those immigrants don't even call themselves Hispanic in surveys. And those who don't call themselves Hispanic on average have political views closer to those of natives.
Okay. This is something that I cover, politics, and I think what you're engaging in with respect is bad social science, because the truth is it doesn't matter whether someone, as on the Supreme Court, whether someone may have a slightly more conservative or liberal position on an issue or two or five. What matters is who they vote for. So in California, for example, the state voted to ban gay marriage heavily with Hispanic support. But the state is, so I guess they would be conservative on that issue, but it's overwhelmingly Democrat to the point it's a one-party state because of Latin American immigration. So it actually doesn't have any effect. In other words, it's just a boon to the Democrats, period. And that's a change immigration, Rod.
Actually, people's issue positions in the long run matter much more than what party they vote for, because the parties, if they want to win, have to adjust their issue positions to where the electorate is. It is true in California, the Hispanics have helped the Democratic Party, but one area, of course, where immigrants do differ from natives is that immigrants are much less likely to be anti-immigrant. So the the Republican Party in California became much more anti-immigrant than it was before. Immigrants adjusted accordingly.
By the way, that's totally silly. I mean, the idea that Pete Wilson, like, this has been looked at pretty carefully, the idea that Pete Wilson, because he backed a measure banning illegal immigrants from getting welfare, somehow turned every Hispanic immigrant in California to the Democratic Party is just absolutely false. I mean, that state has no functioning Republican Party, and it's all because of immigration. If people who lived there in 1975 are the only people voting, it would be a Republican state. I mean, why not just admit that?
Texas had just as big an increase in immigration in the 90s and 2000s as California, yet Texas Hispanics didn't show anything like the same behavior because the Texas Republican Party adopted a very different approach to immigrants than the California one.
That's just wrong. I mean, I don't know anybody who thinks that Texas will be a Republican state in 10 years.
Who knows?
And look, that may be wrong, but people who watch this carefully, including elected officials in the state, believe what the average person believes because it's obviously true, which is massive demographic change has political consequences. Why not just concede that? That's not ignorant to say that.
So who knows what will happen in 10 years, but over the last 20 years, patterns in Texas have been very different than in California, in considerable part because the Republican Party there has taken a different approach. I don't claim that demographic changes never impact politics. All I claim is that the impact is much less than many people claim.
Really? Then why is it that the immigrant-heavy areas of New York State are overwhelmingly Democratic, but the ones with native-born New Yorkers are not? I mean, it's not just California. It's everywhere. And maybe that will change in 100 years. But I guess here's just my point. I'm not saying immigrants are bad. I like immigrants. I'm merely saying that the idea that people who live here and were born here have no right to have a say in this or to be offended by the changes wrought by immigration is just silly. Or they're dumb if they don't like it, which is what you're arguing.
I don't claim people have no right to feel what they do. What I claim is much of what they feel, not all, but much, is influenced by ignorance about a variety of topics related to immigration, which is also true about a lot of public policy issues. So it's not unique to immigration, the problem of political ignorance. It's more widespread than that, but it happens a lot. It's not because people are bad. It's because people, quite understandably, don't spend a lot of their time paying attention to the details of policy issues, so it's easy for them not to know very much.
But what if they notice that the communities they live in are completely different, and the economies they work in are completely different, and the assumptions of their neighbors are not the ones they grew up with? Is that ignorance that leads them not to like it?
Well,
is
actually,
that bigotry?
Actually, survey data shows that people who live in areas with a lot of immigrants tend to be much more pro-immigration than those who live in areas with very few. That's one of the strongest results we have in this area of survey data.
But you're totally ignoring my point, which is, don't people have enough data, as you put it, from living in this country to know that something has changed and this is part of it? Like, they're not necessarily ignorant. Why call them names? Why not acknowledge their views as legitimate?
People can have views that are legitimate, but yet still heavily influenced by ignorance. The two are not mutually exclusive. If you're talking about people's personal experiences as a form of knowledge, those with the most personal experience with immigrants actually tend to be the most pro-immigration.
So then why is there such a large percentage of the population who doesn't learn the esoteric knowledge that you have that they somehow haven't internalized?
Because they're busy with other things. They're spending time on their jobs, their families, and if they're only...
Because there's like endless pro-immigration propaganda. The whole diversity thing is about making sure that nobody complains about the changes taking place in the country. Like, people are taught from birth practically in this country, this is great. They're constantly bombarded with messages on this, and some of them don't buy it. Why?
There's endless propaganda on many political issues from all sides. Most people spend their time focusing on other things. It's totally understandable that they do. There's a lot of other things to watch on TV that are more interesting than political propaganda.
Okay. It's not just political propaganda. There's no part of American life that's not screaming at you, this is great. you better like it or else you're an immoral person. And yet, a large percentage is resistant to that message, and I just find that really
interesting. To me, Fox News is part of American life, and they're not screaming that, and Donald Trump is part of American life, and so forth. So there's a lot of people screaming on all sides, but quite understandably, most of the public tunes that out and instead focuses on other things. And when they do focus on the propaganda, they may pick up very superficial things as opposed to more in-depth facts.
This sounds like the explanation for everything. Why don't we like Obamacare? You just don't know enough. Why didn't you like Hillary? You just don't know enough. You're just not smart enough.
Well, in each of these cases, we actually have data. And Obamacare, knowing more about it, actually makes people more opposed to it.
Okay, well, it makes me opposed to it. Professor Somin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Appreciate it. Up next.